So it's a time of pledges and promises, as you heard, as federal leaders hit the campaign trail across the country. We want to take a look at some of those pledges, see how realistic they are. So let's go to Jamie Gillies, political scientist and professor of communications and public policy at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Morella.
Some would say perhaps the number one issue isn't affordability anymore. It might be our American neighbors. What do you think?
I think it still is the question of who can lead Canada in this time of economic crisis and uncertainty with the United States. That's going to be the driving issue in the campaign. And I think with that April 2nd tariff deadline, at least the early going is going to be dominated by this. But at the same time, these parties and leaders are staking out positions with respect to things like affordability and some of those issues that were front and center right up through the end of 2024. So some of that campaign may pivot to that. But I think this issue of Canada-United States relations and our trading relationship is still number one.
Okay, so let's talk about dollars and cents, because we've heard some of those promises already roll out. Mark Carney is eliminating the consumer part of the carbon tax. But how do you replace revenue like that? Is that clear?
Well, I think it's a little unclear, and I think both Carney and Poilievre are discussing ways in which perhaps we're going to be running some deficits and do some deficit spending because the crisis is on. And we're already seeing that with the dueling tax cut promise. As you said, the elimination of the consumer carbon tax by the Liberals, the fact that all of these are ways in which I think to gin up the economy if we're going to be hit by recessionary pressures from tariffs or from just a general slowdown and rising unemployment as a result of this. So I think all those parties are now looking at ways in which maybe the fiscal basket they were looking at in 2024 is out the window.
So Poilievre wants the carbon tax gone entirely, as you know. So there would be a bigger hole in revenue for that. But he also wants to slash public service, and he said that a number of times. Is that a reasonable sort of counterweight to something like that?
Well, I think here's one of the reasons why I think Mark Carney isn't prepared to do that, and that is because Canada currently has the lowest deficit to GDP ratio in the G7, and our debt to GDP is pretty low as well. So there's room here in a crisis period, and this is something Carney, of course, has background with because he navigated us as Bank of Canada governor during the 07-08 economic crisis as well. So he's used to these kinds of pressures. And I think Poilievre's going to try to pay for it with cuts. However, as we've seen in the United States, I'm not sure those cuts are necessarily popular the way the Trump administration is doing them. So there could be blowback there, and the other party leaders may attack Poilievre on that regard in terms of how he might pay for this.
Jamie, let's talk about the tariffs. You mentioned that April 2nd deadline, and we've heard from the government before the election was called that they would respond to the need for support from Canadians. And we don't know how long tariffs would last. We don't know right now how much those tariffs could be, but we all remember the pandemic. Do you expect to hear from each of these federal party leaders on how they will handle supporting Canadians during that time? And have you heard anything so far on that?
Well, so far, I think even Mark Carney is keeping his powder dry a little bit because A, we're in a writ period, and B, these tariffs may drop, and there's so much uncertainty about them on and around April 2nd. Also, because we're in a writ period, the government is not in a position necessarily to do big policy decisions with respect to tariffs until the election's over and there's a clear mandate for one of these parties to lead Canada. So I think we're going to see all of these campaigns have to pivot and figure out ways to respond on the campaign trail once they hear, which makes this election, of course, highly volatile, quite unusual. So we haven't seen the full array of the way in which these leaders would respond, because I think we're going to get to see it during the campaign. That won't be just a promise. That will be, look, how are you going to actually do this if you're elected on April 28th?
Yeah. How concerned are you about tariffs being sustained over a longer period and the output that could mean for Ottawa?
Well, I think that's sort of the $1 million question in all of this. Is this still a negotiating tactic to get a better deal and a revised Canada, U.S., Mexico free trade agreement, or is this something larger where the United States wants to replace, say, income tax revenue with tariff revenue, and we're going to see broad-based tariffs, say 10% on all of the essentials that the United States continues to import from places like Canada? And if that's the case, that's a trading regime system that has been completely upended, and we're going to have to deal with that long term. And so that is where I think Carney and Poilievre especially have to figure out a way in which to respond to the Trump administration and to the Canadian public of how they're going to actually lead the country over the next 4 years while Donald Trump is president.
Jamie Gillies, appreciate you joining